So we continue in the book of Daniel, and we actually tonight come to the conclusion of the first part of the book. The book can be divided to the first 6 chapters, although there is quite a bit of prophetic activity going on. It's also historical because it tells the story of Daniel's life. Beginning next week, we'll be into the parts that are much more apocalyptic in nature and much more involved in prophecy of the future, particularly the future from Daniel, but some even pointing forward to the future even yet to be. We've said that the biggest point of the book, and I maintain this is true for all of it, both parts, the first 6 and the second 6, is that the kingdoms of men, earthly kingdoms, they come and they go. But the kingdom of God is forever. And it cannot fail because it's God's. And that's one of the really important points of the book of Daniel, particularly for Daniel and his contemporaries who were slaves in a foreign country. They'd done everything, their captors had done everything to erase their national identity, their religious identity, including even changing their names. But God was speaking to and through Daniel to say, don't worry. I know all this is happening. I'm God. I'm in control of it. And there is a kingdom coming that will never pass away. Keep your eyes on that. Of all of the men in the Old Testament, I'm tempted to say I admire Daniel the most. There are 2 reasons for that. The first is because of the major characters in the Bible. Now, when I say major characters, that's somewhat subjective, but of people, I would consider him a major character of the Bible since there's a book of the Bible named after him, and there's quite a bit about him. Daniel, as a major character of the Bible, is the only one that I know of about whom there is nothing negative said. It's never recorded. Now, obviously, he was a sinner, but it's never recorded of him doing anything bad or wrong. And the second thing, which is what we'll see tonight, not the main part of tonight, but a really good part of tonight, is that Daniel was a man of prayer. And I admire that because, as most of you know by now, I don't claim to be the strongest in prayer. Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, it pleased Darius or Darius. Different people pronounce it differently, and I don't know which it is, so I'll just switch back and forth so you'll think that I'm bilingual. It pleased Darius or Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, which are sort of like governors and leaders, to be over the whole kingdom, and that's the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. So there's the king, and then there's 3 guys in charge underneath the king. Daniel's one of them, and then there's 120 governors under them. That these were to give an account to, the satraps were to give an account to these 3 so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the other governors and satraps. So of the 3, he was the top. So he's really kind of second in the kingdom. And why? Because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. The first thing we'll talk about in this section is Daniel's position. Let's not forget that what happened in the previous chapter. Babylon fell. Great Babylon that destroyed Judah and Jerusalem, and led by Nebuchadnezzar, who thought he was forever, even though God said you're not, they fell in a night. In one night, they fell to the Medes and the Persians. And then God raised up the Medes and the Persians, and then God raised up Daniel along with them. You know, it's not difficult to understand this, especially in ancient times. The leaders of those who were conquered, what do you suppose generally happened to all of them? They were killed. But Daniel distinguished himself so greatly that the new regime said, we like this guy, we're going to use him. Part of it, which we'll get into when we get to chapter 9, was that Daniel, it's not recorded explicitly in the scriptures, but in Jewish tradition, Daniel told Cyrus, one of the leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire, that this whole business of conquering the Babylonians was prophesied by Isaiah and Jeremiah, and their names are mentioned. Cyrus is mentioned by name 150 years before he was born. And the guy, whether it was superstition or what, we don't know, but Daniel was favored because of this. How do people get promoted? How do people come and go? One of my favorite memory verses is Psalm 75, verse 6 and 7. It says, "For promotion comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge. He puts down one, and he exalts another." That's the history of the world. People get exalted, people come, people get put down, people go. And then there's someone else to take their place. Daniel was not only not killed by the Babylonians, even though he was from the royal family of Judah, but when the Medes and the Persians took over Babylon, they didn't kill him either, and each time he was promoted. That's a God thing, friends. You can explain this in a lot of ways, but the only true reason, he wasn't exalted merely because of his gifts. He was exalted because it was God's providence that this man started off as a young boy, a young teenage boy at the beginning of the book of Daniel, that God was going to use him in a big way. Verse 4, "So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charges against Daniel." Why? Because the previous verse, this Jewish exile, who's an old guy now, is over them. Wait a minute. How did he get over us? We're the conquering people. He wasn't only one of the Babylonians were conquered, he was conquered by the Babylonians. How did he get above us? They didn't like him. They were jealous. So they tried to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they couldn't find any charge or fault. Why? Because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. As I said, there's just nothing bad ever recorded about Daniel. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So we can't find anything legally, civilly that he's doing wrong that would be against the law that we can get rid of him for. We've got the FBI working on it, and even they can't dig up charges. I'm kind of kidding. There wasn't an FBI yet. So they said, we got to find something about his religious life. So, verse 6, "These governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, 'King Darius,'" or Darius, depending on where you're from, "'live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god,'" watch this, "'or any man,'" which is really ridiculous, "'whoever petitions any god or any man for the next 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter.' Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree." We'll call this section the plot against Daniel. Daniel was hated in verse 4. He was decorated for his integrity. His enemies sought to destroy him. These people, they were occultists, just like the leaders in the Babylonian kingdom. And I think that even though they didn't realize, maybe they didn't connect the dots, but I just wonder if they realized, they knew something about this guy's religion was different. And I wonder if there was thought amongst them that some of their works of evil and of darkness were being thwarted because of this man's prayers. I don't know for sure. The devil would have known, and he could have put that in their heads. Daniel's only crime was his righteousness in verse 5. They couldn't find anything to discredit Daniel. They tried, but they couldn't find anything. So false witnesses, just let's not forget, the devil doesn't care whether the witnesses are true or false. Who else had false witnesses trumped up against him? Jesus, and they were found to be false. I just think it's kind of an aside, if only that were true of me, if only that were true of all of us. Paul writes to Titus and says, in all things show yourself to be a pattern or an example of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. You and I read that and we say, well, that's not exactly true of us. Well, apparently it was more true of Daniel than it would maybe of any of us. But so they said, we got to come up with an angle to get him. So they say, let's make a new law. Now, one of the things from antiquity know about the famous laws of the Medes and the Persians, once a law was enacted, it could never be changed. That was their way of saying, we're it. By the way, it is true of God. People try to change God's law, but God's law doesn't change. God's law is God's law, and it's forever because God's forever. But when human beings think, these laws that we've enacted, they're so good, they will last forever. What insanity. What insanity. Why is it that we can't say that about our laws? Because we're not God. Things change and we're proven to be wrong. It was a foolish law in a couple of respects. One, why was it only for 30 days? If that wasn't evidence that it was a setup, what was? They didn't want this law to be forever. They said it cannot change, but the law itself had a date stamp on it. For the next 30 days, nobody can do this, and you can't change the law. Interesting. And as I said when reading it, I think it's fascinating and ridiculous to say, no one can make a request of any God or of any man. Does that mean you can't say, pass the salt at the dinner table? I mean, you stop and think about how ridiculous this is. And why did the king like it? According to verse 9. What do you think? It stroked his what? Pride. It stroked his pride. It added fuel to his pride. By the way, I'll just mention one other thing. When they came to the king, they said, everybody agrees about this. Can I just give you a tip for life? Anytime someone comes and tells you that everybody's talking about this, or that everybody's against you, or that everybody's for you, it's not true. Everybody doesn't agree on anything. So, people love to make their claim. They like to pad the weight of their claim by saying, everybody agrees with us on this. Can you bring everybody in here and let's get a sworn affidavit from every single one of them that they agree? Well, it's ridiculous. Well, what happens in verse 10? Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, the law, he went home. I like that. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days, meaning since childhood. Daniel's prayer life. Daniel's prayer life was so solid that in spite of the fact that the law said you couldn't pray, what did he do? He went home and prayed. He went home and prayed. He carried on. Why didn't he either stop praying for 30 days or try to hide the fact that he was praying? I think the reason why is that Daniel had a prayer life. Follow me on this. There's a difference between saying prayers and having a prayer life. There's a difference between saying prayers and going before God and pleading your case and praying. And there's a difference between saying prayers merely at set times and being a person whose life is marked by prayer. So as I said, 2 of the things I love most about Daniel, and they're both in this chapter, you couldn't find anything wrong with him. And the guy prayed no matter what. Even when it was not only inconvenient, but when it was against the law, he prayed. A lot of times this chapter is referred to as the chapter about Daniel in the lion's den, because he ends up in the lion's den. I think one of the reasons why he survived the lion's den is because he knew how to go home to his upper room, to his own den, to pray. The guy knew what it was to go to his own little place. As Jesus said, go into your closet, go into your prayer room, go into your inner place, go do this and make this a part of who you are. And I don't want to belabor it, but do we have prayer lives or do we merely say prayers? Do we merely say prayers? Well, the prosecution begins, I didn't say persecution, it is that, but there's a legal angling going on, so I call it the prosecution begins. Verse 11, then these men, the ones who were against him, assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree? You know, something about this. Didn't you just sign something? Yes. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or any man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions? And the king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which what? Cannot be altered. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel. The king knew about Daniel. He recognized Daniel's gifts. He was being moved by the providence of God, but he recognized Daniel's gifts, the kind of man he was. That's why he gave him a high position and even considered him, making him the second man in the kingdom. And these guys that are conspiring against Daniel say, you know that guy Daniel? Yes, yeah, I know that guy Daniel. One of the captives from Judah. By the way, that's an interesting thing to me too. Here he is, in some ways, the second guy in the kingdom, or at least one of the 3 second guys in the kingdom, and they refer to him as, oh, that Daniel, one of the captives from Judah. Sometimes it's hard to escape what people think of you. And so he says he's one of those guys from Judah. He does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree which you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. We got him. We couldn't find him guilty of any regular law, so we made a law that said he couldn't pray, and we knew that he was going to pray anyway, so he did, and now we got him. And they had lubed up the king, if you know what I mean, kind of greased him with pride and accolades, and now it's like, he's against you. He's against you and against your laws. What a corrupt thing that they had going here. He goes in and he makes petition 3 times a day. Verse 14, and the king, when he heard these things, was greatly displeased. Why? Because he knew Daniel and he respected Daniel, and he thought, man, I didn't see this coming. He was very upset. He was displeased with himself for having been hoodwinked, as we say. And he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. We'll figure this out. We'll get around it. But the thing is the law of the Medes and Persians, it was pretty strict, and it couldn't be changed. There was no way to get around it. So they tried, but they couldn't do it. Set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored until the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men, the accusers, approached the king and said to him, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree which the king establishes may be changed. Not us, it's you, king. He's got to go. I think it's interesting in verse 11, how did they know this? They had to spy him out. Not that Daniel was hiding, but he was praying in his house. They spied him out in verse 11. They brought charges in verse 12 and 13. And they looked for charges, and the charges that they came up with, which are phony charges, the first one in essence was treason. He has no regard for you, O king. It wasn't true. It's not true. Daniel did regard the king. It's just that he regarded God more. As it should be. Anarchy. The charge of anarchy. He has no respect for the laws of the land. He doesn't believe in the rule of law. It's not true. Daniel had a regard for the law. He just had the regard for God more. And any law that forbids us to do what God commands or commands us to do what God forbids is a law that we cannot obey. Doesn't mean we have no respect for law. We just have to say that law we cannot obey and be faithful to our God. But what was the real reason? It really wasn't treason, and it really wasn't anarchy. The real reason was they hated God. And when people hate God, what do? They hate his people. Why are Christians the most persecuted people in the world today? Without a doubt. Even secular sociologists recognize that this is going on all over the world. What did Jesus say? They're going to hate you because they hated me before you. It's part of it. It's part of it. It's part of what it means to follow the Lord, is to not be too surprised when people who hate God hate God's people, which just shows that it's satanically and demonically driven, because anyone with any sense at all would look at Christians and say, these people are the least threat to our kingdom. They tend to be passive. They tend to not be people they tend to be law-abiding citizens. They tend to be honest in business, because we answer to a God who's higher even than the king. So what do? They always trump up charges, as they did to Jesus. He's an anarchist. He's an enemy of Caesar. He wasn't an enemy of Caesar. Darius was trapped. Verse 14 and 15. He wanted to get out of it, but guess what? He couldn't. There was a law, and he signed it. And it was a law of the Medes and Persians which cannot be changed. So we pick up in verse 16. Daniel's penalty comes. So the king gave the commandment, and I would think that he did it very sadly. And they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Was that faith in God, or was it wishful thinking? We don't know. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. There's no way of getting out of this. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night, interesting, fasting. And no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. He was troubled over this whole thing. He wasn't a godly man. He was a pagan. But he had enough wits about him to realize this isn't right. This guy is a good man. And he deeply regretted what he had done. Verse 19 is interesting. Then he arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den. What was he thinking he was going to find? It doesn't say. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? He was hopeful. If anybody could do it, it would be Daniel's God. Who knows what he expected? The sentence was pronounced in verse 16. The den was sealed in verse 17. Because it was sealed, no one but God could have ever hoped to have delivered Daniel without knowing what he was doing. Think of this. Darius was validating the miracle God was about to do. Because the thing was sealed. Nobody could say, well, somebody snuck in and somebody did this. And no, it was sealed. And not only by the king, but by others who were in positions of authority. It's in the text. Darius spends a sleepless night in verse 18. He knew he'd acted foolishly. I wonder, I don't have an answer for this. It's just a thought that goes through my strange mind. I wonder who was more sleepless that night, Dan or Darius. They both were in a world of hurt. Darius up at first light. What did he expect to see? We don't know for sure. But in verse 21 through 24, we read of the divine protection. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. Can you imagine how excited Darius must have felt? Oh, he made it. Yes. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. The only law that ultimately matters was the law of God, and I kept that. And so God saved me in this. I was found innocent before him, and also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. I didn't break any of your laws either. Just this thing that you did, which was dumb. Now the king was exceedingly glad. How much he changed from the night before when he was distressed and refused to eat and didn't want any entertainment. He turned off the TV, He just was anxious about Daniel. The king was exceedingly glad the next morning once he now knew that Daniel was alive. He was glad for him. And he commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. I'd like to just throw a thought out there. You can take it or leave it. Is this referring to that he believed that he was going to survive the night in the den? I don't know. But I know what he believed before he believed that. If he believed that, he believed that he couldn't live his life without praying and acknowledging God no matter what the law said. His faith was in more than just, I'll survive this. I don't know that he expected to survive this. Think of how many martyrs for God have not survived. There's no guarantee that God will spare the lives of everyone who's in jeopardy because they're faithful to God. Many, many, many martyrs. As a matter of fact, we read in the book of Revelation that the martyrs who are now in heaven cry out day and night, "How long, O Lord, till you avenge our deaths?" He believed in his God. Verse 24. And the king gave a command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Kind of reminds me of the furnace. They heated up the furnace 7 times, and then when they threw the guys in who were the guilty ones, there was people that burned up just going near the fire. Miraculously, Daniel was fine. Why was he safe? Well, because Daniel was innocent before God, and God saved him. But as I say, many martyrs are not spared. So it's not axiomatic. It's not, well, if you're faithful to God, he won't ever let anything happen to you, because sometimes that's a part of his plan. And I don't have to defend him, and I can't speak for him because he's God. Why do some suffer and some do not? I do not know. I only know that God knows, and he has purposes which he doesn't need to let me in on. The enemies of God ended up getting what they desired against the godly. In this case, they wanted him to be killed by lions, and instead they were killed by the lions. Reminds me of Proverbs. More than once in the book of Proverbs, we read about those who dig a pit for their neighbor will fall into the pit themselves. That just reminds me of a Clint Eastwood movie. That's all I can say. It's just a vengeance movie, You got some bad designs on somebody else. Well, it's coming back on you. I mean, that's like part of the stock and trade of those who write Western movies, We like that. You know why we like that? It's corrupted in us because of sin, but the reason why we like that is because we're created in the image of God, and our God is a God of justice. That's why it's within people, even though it's corrupted in us because we're sinners. There is within all of us a desire for justice. Of course, the interesting thing that proves my point that we're sinners, we want justice for the other guy and mercy for us, generally speaking. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations and languages that dwell on the earth, in other words, to my whole realm, which let's not forget, remember Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the image. Each image was less in the precious metal that it was made of, but each one was stronger. Babylon was great and it was pure, but the Medo-Persian Empire was bigger and in many ways stronger. And then the Greek Empire was bigger and stronger. And then the Roman Empire was bigger and stronger. So back when Nebuchadnezzar said all people in all languages, in other words, all the people of my realm, when Darius says this, speaking for the leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire, he's speaking of even more people than Nebuchadnezzar was speaking of. Because the Medes and the Persians, they conquered everybody within a longer, bigger realm. And what does he say to the people and the nations and the languages that dwell on the earth? Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Remember we said back with Nebuchadnezzar, you could see that he wasn't converted the first two times he made declarations like this, because he always referred to the God of Daniel, or Daniel's God, or the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But he never claimed him as his God until the end of chapter 4, when he was converted. And he recognized, no, he is God over all, including me. Well, this is why I only bring this up to say it's doubtful whether King Darius was a believer. What does he have to say about this God of Daniel? For he is the living God and steadfast forever. These things, it's amazing. He had no way, I just don't believe he had any way of knowing how true what he was saying was. Even like some of you be familiar in the Gospels when the high priest Caiaphas said it's better for one man to die than the whole nation perish, speaking of Jesus. And it says he prophesied these words because it was true. It's better for Jesus to die for all of us than we all perish. But that's not what he was talking about. Well, Darius's decree about the God of heaven, it's truer than true, even though I doubt that he understood what he was saying. He says he is the living God, steadfast forever, and his kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed. Didn't I tell you that's the theme of this whole book of Daniel? And his dominion shall endure to the end. Sounds reminiscent of what Nebuchadnezzar said about God. He delivers and rescues, verse 27. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Darius makes a proclamation, an official proclamation. As I say, I doubt, it's just my opinion, but I doubt it was a true conversion. Daniel was again promoted, and God's man not only lasted. Daniel he's like the spiritual Energizer bunny. Jerusalem falls and is burned to the ground. Daniel survives. Babylon falls and is destroyed. Daniel survives. He survives over and over again. And after the Persians, which is looking forward, and I bring this up because in verse 28 it talks about Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The Medo-Persian was a confederation of two nations, the Medes and the Persians. And eventually, the Persians swallowed up the Medes and became the great Persian Empire, which lasted longer. And it says here, Daniel lasted even after the Medes were gone, and the Persians were the last man standing, and he's still there. And a position of prominence. Why? Because of his giftedness? Because of God's providence. Because of God's providence. 5 observations. I got 5? Yeah, 5 observations and applications, and we'll call it a night. Did Daniel expect to be delivered from the lions? I don't know. My opinion is probably not. But it doesn't matter because he was prepared. He was prepared. If this is what God wills, then he was good with that. Don't forget, as a young boy, as a young teenager, he saw his nation destroyed and probably saw a lot of people killed. It's not like he was unfamiliar with that kind of demise. But he was ready. We need to be ready as much as we can be. Second thing was, why was Daniel so ready to pay the ultimate price? Well, I'm going to say he was so ready to pay the ultimate price. His readiness began in chapter 1 when he refused the king's delicacies, when he denied himself worldly delights so that he could be faithful to God. It always begins in the little things. If we can't be faithful in the little things, don't expect to be faithful in the big things. It began when he refused Nebuchadnezzar's delicacies. It continued as he watched God superintend over so many things throughout the first part of the book of Daniel. He saw Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He saw the image that Nebuchadnezzar built. He knew about his three friends being thrown into the fire and that God had spared them. And he saw Nebuchadnezzar changed. He saw Nebuchadnezzar saved. He'd seen a lot of things from God, and he goes, you know what? I got a really strong hunch about God. You could trust him. You could trust him. You know, we need to remember that when the problems we face, which generally are maybe a little bit smaller than being thrown into a lion's den, you could trust God. Do the best you can. Don't do stupid things to get into trouble. Peter says that there's no great honor in being persecuted for being sinful. But if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, there's honor in that. It began when he refused the king's delicacies. It continued as he watched God superintend over so many things. He saw the sovereignty of God at work over and over again. And I am so thankful that the Lord has established us in this church in the Reformed tradition that puts a premium on the sovereignty of God, because the sovereignty of God gives the people of God boldness. Because we know that God is in control. Even when we're afraid. Even when things are going south fast. No matter what's going on, knowing that God is sovereign gives us hope, even in the worst of situations. That's why, and his faith must have been much more primitive because of where he stood on the timeline, but that's why Job could say, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. God's in control of this, and I'm going to trust him. And then, not only did it begin by being faithful in the little things and then seeing God do so many more things, but his faith and his willingness to pay the ultimate price was bolstered by the fact that Daniel had a prayer life. He didn't merely say prayers. He had a prayer life that nothing could interrupt, nothing could derail. No, it's against the law to pray. Well, excuse me, it's time to go pray. And he just did it. Which brings me to the third thing, lessons to learn from Daniel about prayer. As I said, Daniel had a prayer life. Praying, when I say it was a prayer life, I thought of this in these words. Praying was not merely what Daniel did. Praying is who Daniel was. Nothing could deter him from his understanding of his necessity to have that lifeline with God. You know, it's like we're on life support and our air hose is prayer. And sadly, we ourselves stand on our own air hose too often by neglecting prayer. Daniel prayed in verse 10. Let me point out 4 things about his prayer life. He prayed humbly. It says he was on his knees. He prayed regularly and often. It says he did it 3 times every day. He did it thankfully in verse 10 because it says he gave thanks before his God as he prayed. Don't ever forget to give thanks. Don't just go to God to tell him what you want. Go to God and tell him how thankful you are for all he's given you. And then he prayed consistently, as was his custom from his early days. He was a man of prayer from childhood. Young people, don't think you're going to get better at prayer once you get older, but right now it doesn't matter. No, it matters now because the patterns of prayer that you develop in your life, the earlier you develop them, probably the better your chance that they will be consistently maintained. If we would truly learn from Daniel, it's not enough to see what he did. If we would truly learn from Daniel, we need to seek with all of our hearts to emulate what Daniel did, not just to admire it. And I say this because every time the subject of prayer comes up, I, for one, am convicted. Number 4, Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 6 of Daniel. Where's Jesus in this chapter? I'll give you 2. One's a comparison and one's a contrast. The comparison, Daniel Daniel's prayer life points to Jesus who ever lives to make intercession for us. Aren't you glad that your Savior prays incessantly? He never stops praying for you. I love it when Christians pray for one another and we say, we prayed for you, and somebody was going through a tough time. They go, oh, man, thank you. I know you prayed. I was aware of your prayers. I know that it was the prayers of the people in the church and of my friends and family who kept me going. Listen, the prayers of Jesus never cease. He prays day and night incessantly for every one of us. Every little thing that troubles you, he knows about it, and he's interceding for you at all times. At all times. That's a picture of Jesus and Daniel in comparison. Here's a picture of Jesus and Daniel in contrast. Daniel was spared. False witnesses rose up. He was spared in spite of that. Jesus was not spared. Jesus paid the ultimate price, but then rose from the dead. Who thinks that's good news? He rose from the dead. He died and he rose from the dead. You can't separate those two. For what purpose? So that he could live to fight another day? How about to save his people from our sins? He didn't even need to go to the cross for himself. He went to the cross and gave his life for us, and then he rose from the dead for us. Wow. Lastly, chapter 6, in the context of the message of the entire book. I don't want to shock you with what I'm going to say, because it's what I've told you over and over again since we started this book. While earthly kingdoms come and go, God's kingdom is forever. And when we look at not only his kingdom, but we look at his people, Daniel is a picture for me and a picture for you to say, not only is God's kingdom forever, God's people soldier on. Heaven is reserved for those who overcome to the end. And if you're one of his, you will. Father in heaven, thank you for this time in your word. We pray, God, that we would be encouraged on many levels. We talked about quite a few different things tonight. May we be encouraged on many levels. Speak to each one of us where we need it most. And we'll thank you for it in Jesus' name.